I have told this story before, to the debrief team on Meridian Station, to the quarantine board, to the 2 journalists who somehow got my calm address and would not leave me alone for the better part of a year. I have told it in cold rooms to people with badges and recording equipment and expressions that tried to be neutral and failed. I have told it in pieces, the way you tell something that still has teeth, but I have never told all of it. Not start to finish, not the way it actually went, which was slow and loud and domestic and terrifying in exactly the way no action report ever captures, because action reports do not have room for the parts where you are sitting on your kitchen floor at 3 in the morning, trying to figure out which drawer you put the cable ties in, and whether cable ties will even hold, and whether any of this matters if the atmospheric recycler goes down before the rescue ship gets here. So start to finish, the way it actually went. My name is Dario Vasques. I was 38 years old when the Vorreth organism reached Outpost Caetano-7. I was a Class C infrastructure technician, which is the polite way of saying I fixed things that broke in places no one else wanted to be. Pressure seals, thermal exchangers, water reclamation filters clogged with mineral deposits that smelled like something had died in a drain on a hot day. I had been doing that work for 11 years across 4 different colonial stations, 2 of them worse than Caetano-7 and 1 of them considerably better, and I was good at it. I am not saying that to make myself sound heroic. I am saying it because it mattered later. A man who knows how things are put together has options that other men do not have, and those options compound when everything around him is coming apart. I had been at Caetano-7 for 8 months when the Vorreth came through. My wife Ivy had been there for 9. She had arrived a month ahead of me to set up the biological survey lab, which was her work at cataloging microbial life in the rock strata beneath the habitat's foundation plates. Slow, quiet, careful science that she loved, and that I never fully understood but that I respected completely, because it took a particular kind of patience that I did not possess, and that I admired in her the way you admire a skill that is entirely foreign to your own nature. She could sit with a sample for 4 hours without moving, watching things happen on a cellular level, and find that interesting. I lasted about 12 minutes before I needed to go fix something. We were different in most of the ways that matter and alike in the ways that matter more, which is, I have found, a reasonable basis for a life together. We had been married 6 years. We had met on Kessler Colony when her survey team's water filtration went down, and I was the technician who came to fix it. She made me coffee while I worked, and we talked for 4 hours, and somewhere in those 4 hours I understood that I was not going to want to stop talking to her, which was an unusual experience for me at the time, and one I did not know what to do with until she helped me figure it out. 3 months later we were formally partnered. 2 years after that we were married on Kessler's observation deck, with the gas giant filling the viewport behind us and 14 people in attendance, most of them her colleagues, and it was the best day of my life, and I did not say so at the time because I was not good at saying things like that. But she knew, the way she always knew the things I did not say directly. Caetano-7 was a small outpost, 41 residents at maximum occupancy, mostly rotating specialists and their partners, a handful of permanent administrative staff. The habitat was a standard colonial ring configuration, main ring for living quarters and common areas, secondary ring for laboratories and technical bays, junction corridors connecting them at 6 points. It sat in a stable orbit above a moon that the cartographers had named Peralta, which had nothing of interest on its surface, except for the layered geological formations that had brought Ivy's team out here. The formations were remarkable by any measure, stratified columns of compressed mineral running for hundreds of kilometers in parallel formations that suggested some organizing principle the geologists were still arguing about. Ivy's task was the microbiology inside those formations. What was living in there? What had been living in there for a long time? The outpost itself was functional in the way that small colonial stations are functional. Everything works, nothing is comfortable, and the people either form bonds quickly or make each other miserable in close quarters. We had been lucky. Caetano-7 had a reasonable social ecology, which is to say that people mostly kept to themselves, but looked out for each other in the specific low-key way of people who understand that they are a long way from help. There was one docking bay, one atmospheric processing tower, one med bay with a staff of two, Dr. Marvin, the chief medical officer, and his assistant Rieka, who was 26 and very competent, and had a tendency to hum to herself when she thought no one was listening. Marvin was 53, methodical, and had a voice that stayed level regardless of circumstances, which I would come to appreciate. The Vorreth organism arrived in a rock sample. I want to be precise about that, because for a long time after the event there was a great deal of speculation about the vector, incoming personnel, contaminated supply shipment, deliberate introduction by parties who remain unnamed in the official reports. None of those. IV's survey team brought up a core sample from 60 meters below the surface during a routine extraction, processed it through the standard decontamination protocol, and the organism survived the process. We learned later that standard decontamination protocol, which was designed around bacterial and viral profiles from Earth's biosphere and the handful of alien environments humanity had cataloged in the previous 30 years, was almost entirely ineffective against Vorreth biology. The organism was not bacterial. It was not viral. It occupied a category that the xenobiologists are still arguing about in their journals, though the argument feels academic to me, because whatever category you put it in, what it does is the same. It enters through mucous membrane contact, typically the eyes or the airway, occasionally broken skin if the concentration is high enough. It crosses the blood-brain barrier within 4 to 6 hours, and then it begins to displace. That is the word Dr. Marvin used in the first conversation we had, where he was honest with me about what he was seeing. Displace. The Vorreth organism does not kill the host. It takes up residence in the nervous system and begins rerouting the connections, rewriting the architecture of the mind from the inside in a way that serves its own reproductive and communicative needs. Cognitive function drops first: memory, language, the higher-order processing that allows a person to plan and reflect and recognize the faces of people they love. Motor function is preserved and in some cases enhanced, which is what makes the infected so difficult and dangerous to manage in the later stages. The host's body keeps working, keeps moving, keeps consuming food and water and warmth, keeps breathing, keeps experiencing the physical world. The thing that made that body a person is being pushed aside room by room, like a tenant who comes home to find a stranger has moved in, and is slowly, methodically, replacing the furniture with something that serves the stranger's purpose. Ivy was the first. She came home from the lab on a Tuesday evening and said she had a headache. She sat at the kitchen table, and I brought her water and she drank it and pressed her fingers against her temples in the way she did when a headache was settling in for the night. I told her I would make dinner. She should rest. She lay down on the bed, and I made food neither of us wanted because the supply rotation had left us with nothing interesting, and I was never the cook in our partnership anyway. That was her. I handled the mechanical things. She handled everything that required judgment and subtlety, and the willingness to actually read the instructions, which we both understood was the better arrangement. I brought her a bowl of something labeled protein stew, in a way that promised more than it delivered, and sat on the edge of the bed, and we talked about nothing in particular for a while. She had a headache. We did not think anything of it. By morning she was different. Not dramatically. That is the thing no one understands until they have seen it. The Vorreth progression is not dramatic in the early hours. There is no sudden transformation that announces itself, no moment you can point to and say, "There, that is where it happened." What there is absence, a subtraction. She woke up and she looked at me, and something was not there that had always been there. The thing behind her eyes that knew me and was glad of that knowledge, that had opinions and warmth and the specific quality of attention she brought to everything that interested her and withheld from things that bored her. She looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you are assessing for usefulness. Present, untroubled, empty of everything that made her her. I called Dr. Marvin. He came within 20 minutes, which on an outpost this size meant he was already awake and dressed, which meant someone else had called him first. He examined Ivy with the careful thoroughness of a man who already had a hypothesis and was hopping to be wrong. She sat on the edge of the bed and let him move her limbs and shine lights in her eyes and ask her questions she answered in monosyllables, if she answered at all. She was not combative. Not yet. In the early stage, the infected are compliant in a way that is almost worse than the aggression that comes later. They do what you direct them to do. They eat when you put food in front of them. They follow movement with their eyes and turn toward sound. They are present in every physical sense and absent in every sense that matters. Marvin pulled me into the corridor and he told me what he suspected. He had seen 2 other cases overnight, both members of Ivy's survey team, both presenting with the same pattern of cognitive withdrawal. He had been on the comm with the nearest medical response relay for 3 hours, and the information they had given him was incomplete and troubling. The organism was not in the pathogen database. There were field reports from 2 other colonies that described something similar, but the symptom progression differed enough that he could not be certain it was the same thing. What he could tell me with confidence was that it spread through direct fluid contact, and that once the neurological displacement reached a certain threshold. He was vague about what that threshold looked like, but precise about what came after it. The infected became dangerous. How dangerous? I said. He did not answer immediately, which was its own answer. The field reports describe aggressive feeding behavior, he said. Biting, primarily. The organism appears to use saliva as a transmission vector once the host reaches late-stage displacement. I looked at the closed door of our quarters. Through the door I could hear Ivy moving, the soft footfall of her going to the window and standing there, which she had been doing since she woke up. Standing at the window and looking at the surface of Peralta below with no particular expression. How long do we have before she reaches that stage? I said. I don't know, he said. 12 hours, 36. I have no reliable baseline to work from. I need tissue samples and time and access to equipment that is going to have to be improvised from what we have in this medbay. He paused. I sent an emergency request to the medical relay and they are processing a response. That will take time we may not have. And treatment, I said. I am working on it, he said. But Vasks. He stopped and looked at me with the expression of a man who has been practicing medicine long enough to know when there is no good version of what he is about to say. You need to understand that I cannot guarantee anything at this stage. The displacement process, if I cannot interrupt it before it completes, may not be reversible. I want to be honest with you about that. She is not a case, I said. She is my wife. He nodded. He did not argue. I will give him that. The outpost went to internal lockdown within the hour. 6 infected, all from the survey team that had processed the core sample. The remaining 35 residents were quarantined in sections, comm channels restricted to emergency use, the docking bay sealed. The supply ship that had been due in 4 days received instructions to hold at the boundary marker until further notice. Rieka set up a triage area in the secondary ring and moved the other 5 infected there under what passed for containment. Marvin went to his laboratory and did not come out for the better part of 2 days. I stayed with Ivy. I want to explain something about that decision, because it has been questioned more than anything else in the 9 days of debrief, and in every interview I have given since. People want to know why I did not move to the safe quarters with the uninfected residents. The answer is simple enough that it should not require explanation, but I have found that it always does because the people asking it have not been in that situation, and from the outside the simple answer sounds like sentiment, like emotion overriding judgment. It was not sentiment, it was calculation, and it was sound. She was my wife. I knew her body, her movements, her habits, the specific way she held herself when she was tired or hungry or in pain. I knew which things in our quarters she would reach for and which things she would ignore. I knew the layout of every room, where the sharp edges were, where the floor had a slight unevenness she always stepped around, where the light came from and what it illuminated. I knew these things in the embodied way, you know, the environment you have lived in for months alongside someone you have known for years. No one else in that outpost had that knowledge, and that knowledge would be the difference between managing the situation and losing control of it. I was also a man who fixed things for a living, which meant I thought about failure modes and containment, and what you do when a system is broken and you have to hold it together with whatever is in reach while you work on a real solution. If I stayed with her, I could manage her. I could keep her calm in the early stage, keep her fed and watered, monitor her progression, and relay clinical information to Marvin that he could not get from a camera feed. And if she reached the late stage while I was still in those quarters, which I had to plan for, honestly, in the way a good technician plans for the worst outcome while working toward a better one, I had prepared for that as well. The barrier from the supply crates, the jacket rated for chemical exposure, the routes to the door that I had measured in seconds. The point is that my presence in those quarters was not a husband refusing to accept reality. It was a technician working the problem with the best available resources. I happened also to be the husband, which is why I was willing to do it. But the reasons the approach made sense were professional ones, and they held up to examination. The first day was almost normal. That is not the right word, but I do not have a better one. She was quiet. She ate when I put food in front of her, and she drank water when I offered it, and she moved around the room in slow circles when she was not standing at the window. She did not speak in sentences, but she made sounds when I spoke to her, not responses exactly, more like acknowledgments, the conversational equivalent of a light still blinking on a panel that has otherwise gone dark. She followed me with her eyes when I moved. I kept talking to her the entire time. About nothing. About work, the thermal exchanger in Junction 3 that had been making a high-frequency whine I needed to address, the light over the workbench that needed a new emitter, the coffee maker with the fault in its temperature regulator that I had been meaning to fix for 2 months. I talked about the geological formations on Peralta and what she had told me about them over the months we had been here, the stratification patterns and what they suggested about the moon's history. Things she had explained to me with patience and enthusiasm, while I tried to follow along and mostly managed. I talked about our quarters on Kessler, and the way the air had always smelled slightly of the chemical sealant they had used on the viewport frames, and how we had gotten used to it so thoroughly that we had not noticed it until we left, and then every other habitat smelled wrong for a while. I talked and she listened or did not listen, and I pretended the distinction did not matter. Marvin calmed me at hour 14. He had isolated the organism's reproductive mechanism. It divided by budding, which was unusual enough that it told him something concrete about its biology and gave him a theoretical pathway to interrupt the cycle. Theoretical. He needed another 6 to 8 hours to synthesize a test compound, and then he needed a subject. "I'm here," I said. "You're not infected." "She is," I said. "Test it on her. Not the others in the secondary ring first, not a controlled comparison. Her first as fast as you can get it ready." There was a pause. Vasks. "If the compound doesn't work correctly, it could accelerate the progression, or cause acute systemic inflammation, or fail in a way I haven't anticipated because I am building this from incomplete information in a med bay that is not equipped for this kind of synthesis." "Can it kill her?" I said. A shorter pause. "I don't believe so, but I cannot guarantee." "Try it on her," I said. "Whatever timeline you were planning, cut it in half. She's still here, Marvin. There's still something to save, but I don't know how long that remains true." He said he would try. He said it in the flat, professional way he said most things, which did not tell me whether he thought it would work, but meant that he was going to do it anyway. That was enough. At hour 16, she became aggressive for the first time. I was at the workbench going through my toolkit, taking inventory the way I always do when I am managing anxiety, counting bolts, checking calibration on my multimeter, making sure I know what I have and where it is. Familiar physical tasks. There is a kind of steadiness in handling things you know well, and I needed steadiness. I was not paying enough attention to the room, which was a mistake, and I registered it as a mistake the moment she moved. She came across the room faster than I expected. That was the first concrete sign of the motor enhancement Marvin had described. The Vorreth organism was doing something to her musculature or her nervous system's motor pathways that made her movement suddenly precise and fast in a way that was wrong for the way she usually moved, which was considered an unhurried and characteristically deliberate. She got her hands on my arm and she was strong, stronger than she should have been. I got loose and put the workbench between us and held my hands out, open, non-threatening, and talked to her in a low voice. Her name repeated, not demanding, just present, a sound she had been hearing from me for 6 years. After 11 minutes she settled, stopped advancing, went back to her circles. After that I secured the sharper items in the toolkit in the supply cabinet and rearranged the room, pushed the furniture to create clear sightlines and wider corridors between pieces, moved the cables that had been running along the floor and secured them to the wall. The kind of work you do before you bring a large piece of machinery into a space. You clear for it, you give it room to move without hitting anything, you make the environment manageable. That is what she was now, in practical terms. Not a threat. Not a monster. A variable I needed to manage while I waited for a solution. The emotional reality of that was something I set aside in a specific compartment and kept there. I built a barrier from the supply crates in the corner near the door. Not to cage her, I was not ready to do that, and more to the point I did not think I would have to, but to give myself an exit point and a fallback position. A place I could reach in the time it would take her to cross the room at her new speed. I tested the distance twice, walking it at the pace I estimated she could manage. It was enough, probably enough. The margin was smaller than I wanted. I did not sleep. I sat in the corner near the door with a light on low and a comm unit clipped to my collar, and I watched her move around the room in the slow, deliberate circles that the infected move in when they are not fixated on a specific stimulus. She went to the window. She stood at the window for a long time, looking at the surface below, and I found myself wondering what the organism was perceiving through her eyes, whether it understood what it was looking at, whether it was looking for anything in particular. The particular quality of that vigil is hard to describe to someone who has not kept one. It is not like waiting for news, which is passive. You sit with the uncertainty and time passes whether you are doing anything or not. It is more like a maintenance watch on critical equipment. You are present, continuously attentive, taking readings, and the vigilance itself is the work. Every time she moved, I noted it. Every time she stopped, I noted that. The pattern of her circuits, the duration of her window standing, the way she tracked sound versus the way she tracked visual movement. I was building a profile of her current state the way I built profiles of malfunctioning machinery, not to understand the malfunction emotionally but to predict it, to know what it was going to do before it did it, so I could be ready. That is the part that is hard to explain. I was studying my wife like a failing system, and I was doing it with everything I had, with more attention than I had given to anything in my professional life, because the system was her, and I needed it to keep running until Marvin found the answer. I thought about the first time we had come to this room, the day we had arrived at Caetano-7 together, carrying bags through the docking corridor, while the station administrator gave us the orientation briefing. I had been only half listening because Ivy was pointing at things through the corridor viewports and describing what she wanted to do with the survey equipment, and she had the specific brightness in her voice that she got when a project was genuinely exciting to her, and I had been more interested in listening to that than in the administrator's briefing. She had noticed and told me later I needed to go back and read the orientation materials, which I had not done. 6 years, 2 colonies, one bad posting on a survey platform that we had both agreed to never discuss again. The observation deck on Kessler with the gas giant in the viewport and 14 people, and her hand in mine. At hour 22, she came at me again. This time there was less warning. I was on the wrong side of the room from my barrier, which was a lapse I had been aware of and had not corrected quickly enough, and she crossed the distance before I could get fully set. I got my forearm up and took her hands on the sleeve of my jacket, and I managed to turn her momentum and guide her into the wall rather than absorb the impact directly, which is a technique not from any training but from 11 years of managing heavy equipment in confined spaces. You do not fight the weight, you redirect it. She hit the wall and stopped, disoriented by the impact, and I stepped back and kept the barrier between us and talked to her until the fixation faded. 11 minutes again. I noted the consistency. She had bitten into the sleeve of my jacket. The material held. It was rated for chemical exposure, tougher than standard fabric, and I had worn it that morning for this reason specifically. I calmed Marvin. She's progressing faster than the 12-hour estimate, I said. 2 aggressive episodes, motor enhancement confirmed. What's the status on the compound? I have a test quantity ready, he said. Another hour for quality check. I'm looking at the feed from the secondary ring. 3 of the other 6 have reached what I think is late stage. His voice was flat with exhaustion. I need to get it to you. Send Rieka with it, I said. Not you, I need you in the lab. He sent Rieka. She arrived at the door 40 minutes later with a sealed case and the expression of someone who had spent the walk here rehearsing being calm. She was 26, and she was good at her job, and I could see in the set of her jaw that she had thought about whether she wanted to come to this particular door, and had decided yes. I appreciated that decision more than I said. Tell me what's in there, I said. A Vorreth growth inhibitor. Dr. Marvin synthesized it to target the budding mechanism. The theory is that if you stop the organism from reproducing within the nervous system, the existing population dies off and the displacement reverses partially at least, in the best case. She held the case carefully. If it works, it should stop the progression within a few hours. If it doesn't work, she could have an inflammatory response, increased aggression, or no change at all. How confident is Marvin? He's a doctor, she said. He said 60%, which means he's less confident than that and is trying to give you something to work with. I took the case. Inside, a standard injection unit loaded and a secondary unit labeled in Marvin's handwriting. Secondary dose, minimum 6 hours after first. Do not administer if subject exhibits respiratory distress. I told Rieka to stand in the corridor and watch through the viewport. Not for her benefit. For mine. If something went wrong, I needed someone who could get Marvin on the comm without coming through the door. Getting the injection into Ivy was not the hardest thing I did during those 2 days, but it is the moment I think about most. She was near the window. I crossed the room slowly, keeping my movements even. The way you approach equipment that might be under unexpected tension, nothing sudden, nothing that would read as a threat. She tracked me with her eyes. The scent tracking Marvin had described was active by that point. I could see the way her attention sharpened as I got closer. I got within arm's reach and put my hand on her arm, and she let me touch her, the way she had in the early stage, that terrible compliance that was worse in some ways than the aggression. I said her name, just her name, the way I always said it, quietly. The way you say the name of someone you have said it to thousands of times across 6 years, and it still sounds like something worth saying. She turned her face toward me. The eyes were not right. The focus was wrong by a degree, the way a calibrated instrument reads slightly off when something has interfered with its baseline setting. But she turned toward me, and I administered the injection. She did not react immediately. She stood at the window for another 23 minutes while I sat on the floor 8 feet away and watched and waited for a response that could go several ways. Rieka's face was visible through the viewport the whole time, patient and pale. Nothing inflammatory happened. Ivy's movement slowed slightly. Then she went back to her circles, and the circles were marginally slower than they had been. I noted that and calmed Marvin, and he said it might mean something or it might not. At hour 26, the orbital alert sounded. There are tones that a colonial station trains you to respond to before you have thought about it, and the orbital alert is one of them. 3 long rising notes that mean something external has changed in a way that requires attention now. I went to the comm panel by the door without taking my eyes off Ivy. The Vorreth organism, it turned out, was not only inside the station. The surface survey, the work Ivy's team had been doing, had disturbed something deeper in the geological strata than the preliminary scans had indicated. Peralta was not geologically inert in the way the initial survey had characterized it. The formations that had attracted Ivy's interest were, the monitoring sensors now showed, the external expression of a vastly larger subsurface structure, and the Vorreth organism was not a contaminant living in that structure. It was the structure, or part of it, or the structure was part of it. The relationship was something the xenobiologists were still trying to articulate in language that made sense, and it resisted articulation because the concept it required was outside the framework we had available. The short version, the organism was a network, not a colony of individual organisms that communicated. A network. One thing, distributed through the strata over an area that the sensors estimated at several hundred square kilometers, and the humans on Caetano-7 had pulled a piece of it up through the surface and into their home. The network had noticed. The surface sensors showed movement in the strata, not geological movement, not the slow settling of rock under orbital stress that the instruments were calibrated to detect and log. Movement with pattern and direction. Movement with purpose. Vasks, Marvin's voice on the comm, quiet and flat and precise. I need you to hear something. I'm listening. The organism is not propagating randomly. The 6 infected members of the survey team were selected, specifically. The Vorreth network identifies potential relay nodes through chemical signaling during close contact with the surface material. The people who processed that core sample were the ones who inhaled the aerosolized sample particles during decontamination. He paused. They were chosen because they were present. Proximity. The network does not understand the difference between a rock sample processor and an enemy combatant. It just knows that certain organisms were close enough to reach. I looked at Ivy at the window. The infected hosts are relay nodes, he continued. Communication points. The organism uses the nervous system as a signal transmitter. The displaced cognitive architecture becomes part of the network's communication structure. When enough nodes are established in a given area, the network can coordinate action at range. Another pause, shorter. The surface sensors show approximately 400 individual organism bodies moving toward the foundation of the habitat. At their current rate, they will reach our foundation plates in 9 to 11 hours. I cannot tell you with certainty what happens after that. Our foundation plating is rated for geological stress. It was not designed with biological infiltration in mind. The line was quiet for a moment. How many people know this? I said. You, me, Rieka, and Brandau. I told Brandau 4 minutes ago. His voice had something in it that was not quite anything I could name. Not fear. Resignation, perhaps, or the specific kind of focus that comes when a man understands that there is exactly one path through what is coming, and it is narrow, and he is going to walk it regardless. I wanted you to know because you are going to do something about it. Yes, I said, I am. I want to be clear about the next several hours. I was not calm. I was focused, which is a different thing. Calm is an absence of agitation. Focus is agitation that has been given a direction and a task. I had 9 to 11 hours and a list of what the station had and what I understood about how it was built, and I began working through the problem the way I had always worked through problems, methodically, from first principles, with the understanding that there was almost certainly a solution, and that finding it was a matter of not stopping until it appeared. I have been asked since whether I was afraid. The honest answer is that fear requires you to be thinking about outcomes, and I was not thinking about outcomes. I was thinking about the next step in the sequence. Fear is what happens in the space between knowing what you need to do and being willing to do it. When that space collapses, when what you need to do and what you are doing are the same thing continuously, without pause, fear does not have room to operate. I am not saying this to make myself sound courageous. I am saying it because it is the actual mechanics of how a person functions in a situation that should be too large for them. You make the situation small. You make it the next task, and then the next one. The first thing I did was calm Rieka and tell her everything Marvin had told me. She absorbed it in the way she absorbed most things, which was quickly and without visible panic. She said, "What do you need from me?" That was the right question, and she asked it without prompting. The second thing I did was pull up every technical schematic I had access to for Caetano-7's foundation system. I knew those schematics. 8 months of maintenance work meant I had spent time in every crawlspace and junction in the station. But I went through them again with the specific question of where the vulnerability points were. Where a biological organism, even one that was not large individually, could find purchase in the joins and plates. Where previous maintenance had been delayed, or where the construction tolerances were at the edges of their rating. I found 7 points of concern. I sent the list to Marvin, flagged for immediate attention. I sent the same list to Brandau, the station administrator, who had 35 people to manage in quarantine, and was doing it with the particular controlled efficiency of a man who has accepted that this is the situation, and is dealing with it rather than wishing it were different. He calmed me back in 4 minutes. "What do you need?" he said. 3 maintenance bots, 2 exterior-rated. The emergency sealant supply from Bay 4. Authorization for external hull access from the sealed maintenance corridor in Junction 2 so I can see the foundation joins directly rather than working from schematics. He gave me everything I asked for without discussion. That kind of trust is not nothing. I did not have time to say so then, but I said so later. The next 6 hours were the kind of work that does not make for a good story, but that was the difference between 41 people living and something else. Crawlspaces and compound sealant, and the specific mathematics of pressure ratings and cure times. The secondary maintenance bot's extension arm that could not quite reach the angle I needed at Junction 4, until I modified the attachment head with a bracket I fabricated from an empty equipment housing. The foundation join at the base of Junction 6 that had been flagged in my maintenance log 3 months ago and had not been addressed because the rating was within tolerance for geological stress, not for biological infiltration, which was a different kind of force load entirely. The work held me. That is what I said earlier, and it remains true. When I was in the crawlspace behind Junction 2, running sealant compound along a join by hand because the bot could not get its applicator into that angle, I was not thinking about IVET at the window or the heat signatures on the surface sensors, or the 9 hours that had been 11 hours and were now 7. I was thinking about whether the compound was curing at the right rate in this temperature, and whether the next join over needed the same treatment, or whether the plating there was solid. The work held me, and I let it hold me because the alternative was to feel the weight of what was happening, and I could not afford that yet. I checked the room camera every 20 minutes. IVET was still moving, still circling, still standing at the window between circuits. At hour 29 she stopped circling and sat down on the bed, sat down voluntarily. That was not late-stage behavior. Late stage did not rest. I calmed Marvin. "She sat down," I said. I saw it. He was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him in the background, his instruments, his keyboard. That's behavioral change, Vasks. The Vorreth at late stage doesn't choose to rest. That's the organism responding to the inhibitor. The displacement cycle may be slowing. A pause. It's working. I think it's working. How long before you know for certain? I said. Hours, maybe longer, but he stopped. I have been thinking about something while you have been in those crawl spaces. The compound I developed, it targets the budding mechanism throughout the organism's biology, not just in a human nervous system, in any Vorreth tissue. He said this carefully. If the network is integrated and the surface behavior suggests it is deeply integrated, then a disruption introduced at any point in the network should propagate. I came out of the crawl space and sat against the corridor wall with my toolkit between my knees. You're saying if we deliver the compound to the surface colony, I said. A sufficient quantity, delivered in a way that reaches the colony body, not just the surface, driven into the strata. He paused. I am speculating. I want to be honest about that, but the logic is consistent with what I understand of the organism's biology. How much of the compound do you have? I said. He told me. I looked at the ceiling of the junction corridor and thought about what the station had and what I could build from it in the time remaining. Give me 4 hours, I said. What the station had. Emergency sealant bots with pressurized dispensing systems designed to deliver compound at high pressure in difficult conditions. A chemical fabrication unit in Riika's supply room that was intended for pharmaceutical compounding, but could be reconfigured for a different synthesis if you had the base components and did not mind voiding several warranties. And the external survey drill rigs that Ivy's team had left in the geology bay. Heavy equipment, designed to drive sample cores 60 meters into the surface of Peralta, now sitting unused while the planet below moved its pieces toward us. I will not pretend this was elegant engineering. It was not. It was a man who fixes things, working with what was available, doing the math where the math could be done, and making his best estimate where it could not. I pulled Riika in to manage the fabrication unit because her knowledge of organic compound chemistry was far beyond mine, and I was honest about that. She reconfigured the unit in 40 minutes and ran the synthesis in parallel while I worked on the delivery system. I calmed Brandau and asked for 2 volunteers rated for suited exterior work. He asked and got 7. I took 2 of the best suited ones and sent the other 5 to reinforce the foundation weak points with physical barriers, anything that would add time if the compound delivery did not work as intended. The geology drill rig required the most time and the most improvisation. The rig itself was sound. Ivy's team had used it for months, and it was maintained properly, designed to drive sample cores 60 meters into rock at pressures that would have made most mechanical systems nervous. What it was not designed for was delivering liquid compound at dispersal rather than extracting a core sample. That required a different head assembly. One that would accept a pressurized feed and distribute it radially through the strata at multiple depths, rather than pulling a column straight up. I had to fabricate it from what was in the geology bay and what I could cannibalize from emergency supplies without compromising systems I still needed. Emergency conduit pipe, irrigation system fittings meant for the habitat's water recirculation, a pressure regulator salvaged from a spare atmospheric processing unit that had been sitting in storage for at least a year. I fitted them together twice, and both assemblies failed pressure testing. The third configuration held. I tested it at 60% of the intended operating pressure and then stopped testing it because I was out of time and had to commit to what I had. That is a specific kind of decision, committing to something you have not fully verified. It is different from calculated risk. It is closer to trust in your own work, in the sequence of logic that produced this particular assembly in the first place. I had built it as well as I could in the time available. That would have to be enough. The compound went into the sealant bots dispensing systems at hour 37. The exterior workers took the bots out through the sealed maintenance corridor in their suits, moving along the hull to the foundation line. The drill rig, with its improvised dispersal head, was positioned over the primary surface access point in the geology bay floor. Riika watched the chemical readings. Marvin watched everything from his lab and said almost nothing. which I had come to understand was his version of confidence. I was in the monitoring station when the surface signatures began their final approach. The sensors showed them as thermal differentials in the strata, the Vorreth biomass moving with the coordinated unity of a network that had been routing around obstacles for 7 hours and had found the path it was going to take. They moved toward the foundation joins I had sealed first. The seals held. They redirected. I watched them redirect. They were not intelligent in the way a human being is intelligent, but the network was responsive in real time, adjusting to resistance, finding alternate paths with the patience of something that had been doing this for a very long time in geological terms. They found the join at Junction 6, the one I had almost not reinforced in time. The physical barrier held it. Now, I said to the exterior team. The compound went out in a pressurized mist across the surface above the primary colony area, and the drill drove a secondary delivery point 40 meters down, past the surface expression, and into the strata where the main body of the network had its density. The compound in that form, aerosolized at the surface, pressure-driven into the rock below, was a rougher version of what Marvin had synthesized, diluted and modified by the constraints of the delivery system. I had not been able to test whether it would retain its efficacy in this form. I had made my best estimate, accounted for the dilution, and pushed the delivery pressure as high as the improvised dispersal head could handle without failing. On the foundation sensors, the heat signature slowed. I watched that. I watched it the way you watch a critical reading when you do not know which direction it is going to move and everything depends on it. The signature slowed and then stopped and then, over the following 18 minutes, began to lose coherence. The tight, organized pattern of a coordinated network coming apart into individual movement and then into stillness, one signature after another. Marvin's voice, "I think it's working." I sat in the monitoring station with my hands flat on the console and breathed. Just breathed, for a moment, the way you breathe when you have been holding your breath for longer than you knew. At hour 39, I went back to our quarters. Ivy was still on the bed. She looked at me when I came in and her eyes were closer to right than they had been since the first morning. Not fully right. The focus was still slightly off, but she tracked me with recognition, not assessment, recognition. The thing that knew me was still there, had survived somewhere behind what the organism had done in whatever small space it had been pushed into and was coming back. She said my name. Just the name. A single word, and it sounded like she was confirming that it still fit her mouth, that she still knew what it referred to. That the path back through the rearranged house was navigable. I sat down on the floor next to the bed, and I did not say anything for a while. "There's something wrong with my head," she said. "I know," I said. "Marvin's working on it. It's getting better." She was quiet. "How long has it been?" "About 39 hours. She absorbed this. She had a way of being still that was different from the stillness of the past day and a half. This was her stillness, the one I knew, the particular quality of attention she brought when she was processing something significant. "You stayed," she said. "Yes. You didn't have to." "I know," I said. She turned her head and looked at me. Her eyes were working mostly. The focus issue was resolving slowly as the compound did what Marvin had designed it to do. I did not say anything else. I did not need to. She was there mostly, and we both understood the rest of it. "You did something," she said. "It was not a question." "Fixed a few things," I said. "Dario." The specific inflection she used when I was underplaying a situation, which I did habitually, and which she had been correcting for 6 years with varying success. "I'll tell you all of it," I said, "later." The rescue ship arrived 8 hours after that. It had been at the boundary marker, and Brandau calmed them the all clear once the foundation sensors confirmed network decoherence below the station. The medical team that came aboard was professional and thorough, and not especially interested in the details of the dispersal system, which was fine. Marvin had the compound data ready for them in a format that would be useful for the field reports, and that was what they needed. They took their readings and administered follow-up treatment, and cleared the outpost for evacuation in stages. Marvin had not slept in over 40 hours by the time the ship docked. He sat down in his lab chair once the medical team took over and did not move for a while. I went in and told him what he had done. He said that he had done his job. I said yes, and that his job had been harder than any version of it he had signed up for, and that 41 people were going to Meridian Station alive because of how he had done it. He nodded. He did not argue. The debrief was 9 days. I have told it many times since, in many rooms, to many people with different reasons for needing to know. The version in the official record is accurate, but it is the kind of accuracy that fits a form, that reduces things to data points and decision nodes and outcome metrics. It does not have room for the room camera checks every 20 minutes or the specific sound of Ivy saying my name on the 39th hour. It does not have room for Rieka's face through the viewport, patient and pale and there. It does not have room for Brandau asking what do you need and meaning it. It also does not have room for the fact that the dispersal head I built from conduit and irrigation fittings. The third attempt, the one I pressure tested at 60%, and then committed to, failed at full operating pressure for approximately 90 seconds during the delivery, causing a drop in the compound dispersal rate that I estimated at the time as 15 to 20%. Whether that gap affected the final outcome, whether the network decoherence we saw on the sensors was complete, or whether there remains an undisrupted section of Vorreth biology in the lower strata of Peralta, that question is in the follow-up survey reports, and I have been told the answer is probably fine. I believe that, but I note it, because a man who builds things under pressure should be honest about the moments where the build did not fully hold, and what he did anyway. I have left one thing out until now, because it is not the kind of thing that fits a debrief either. On the third night in the monitoring station, sitting with the foundation sensor feed on one screen and the room camera feed on the other, running the numbers on the dispersal system for the fourth time because the numbers kept being insufficient, I thought about stopping. Not dramatically. Quietly, the way a man thinks about a thing when the gap between what the situation requires and what he has available is wide enough that the math genuinely does not resolve in his favor. I sat with that thought for about 90 seconds. It had a certain weight to it. It was not irrational. Then I got up and went back to work. I do not think the Vorreth network had accounted for that. I do not think it had a framework for a creature that does the math, finds it insufficient, and continues anyway. That is not a failure of the network's sophistication. It is simply a thing outside its reference. The network plans for resistance that has limits. It adjusts for obstacles. It roots around everything that can be rooted around. What it encountered at Caetano-7 was a man who had decided that the obstacle it represented was not one of his options for stopping, and that particular kind of obstacle is not something you root around. You either break it or you do not. It did not break us. Ivy and I left on the rescue ship. She slept most of the transit deeply, which Marvin said was expected and necessary and not negotiable. The nervous system's recovery from Vorreth displacement required rest at a level the body demanded and did not ask permission for. I sat in the seat next to her berth and watched her breathe. I did not think about much. I had used up most of my thinking in the previous 47 hours, and what remained was a quieter thing. When she woke up, she asked me to tell her all of it, start to finish. So I did. The barrier from supply crates, the jacket I had worn on purpose, the injection and the 11 minutes after, the orbital alert and what Marvin had told me and the 7 foundation weak points and the 6 hours in the crawl spaces, the dispersal head built from conduit pipe and irrigation fittings, and the 3 attempts before it held. The 400 heat signatures on the sensor feed going dark one by one over 18 minutes. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which was unusual for her, which told me how closely she was listening. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, looking at the ceiling of the berth bay with the expression she had when she was recalibrating. "The dispersal head," she said finally. "The one you built from conduit." "Yes." "Did it work correctly?" "Close enough," I said. She turned her head and looked at me, and her eyes were entirely hers. Entirely right, all of it back. "You voided the warranty on the fabrication unit," she said. "Multiple warranties," I said, "and possibly some regulations. I have been advised by Brando not to go into detail in the debrief about the drill rig modifications." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Good." The ship moved through the dark between Peralta and the transit corridor. Outside the viewport, the moon was pale and still, and whatever remained of the Vorreth network in its geological formations was silent and dispersed, and no longer organized toward anything. We did not look back at it. There was nothing left there worth looking at, and we had each other and 41 people alive and a long transit ahead of us, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was, if you wanted to be precise about it, the entire point.